Have you ever been caught in a dream so vivid, so disturbingly real, that the lines between reality and imagination seem to vanish? It's as if some part of you knows you're not awake, but another part is gripped by a fear that can't be shaken, a fear that feels as genuine as the pulse in your veins. My name is Eamon Harrow, an archaeologist and folklore researcher, and what I'm about to share with you is more than a story. It's a confession of something I still can't comprehend. This isn't a tale for the faint-hearted, so if you think you're ready, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and let's journey together to the shadowy places where reality and nightmare collide. It all started on an ordinary night, or at least that's what I thought. I had just finished reading an ancient manuscript, something that whispered of unspeakable rituals and long-forgotten rites meant to guard against a mysterious, watchful force. My mind was heavy with images of eerie symbols and cryptic warnings as I finally drifted into sleep. But what awaited me in the dream was unlike anything I had ever encountered. I found myself in an unfamiliar place, somewhere ancient and drenched in an aura of dread. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves, their spines cracked and faded with age, yet somehow untouched by time. There was a smell in the air, damp, earthy, like soil freshly turned, but laced with something sharper, almost metallic. It felt as though I'd walked into a place where history had bled into the walls, staining the atmosphere with secrets no one was meant to know. Flickering candlelight cast long, shivering shadows across the floor, and somewhere, in the depths of that darkened room, I heard a faint, persistent scratching. The sound echoed through the silence, chilling me to the bone as if something, or someone, was clawing its way closer, just beyond my sight. The strangest thing was the overwhelming sensation of familiarity, as if I'd been there before, maybe in another lifetime, or perhaps in a long-buried memory I could no longer access. Every instinct urged me to leave, to break free of whatever had pulled me into that place, but my feet remained rooted. It was as though something beyond my control held me there, forcing me to observe, to listen. I took a hesitant step forward, and the floor creaked underfoot, the sound thick and heavy, like a warning echoing back at me from the darkness. A voice whispered softly from behind, a mere breath in the silence, sending a cold shiver down my spine. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, taunting, almost amused, as though whatever lurked in the shadows was aware of my fear, savoring it. My heart pounded as I tried to turn, to face whatever was watching me, but the room seemed to expand and twist, stretching away, trapping me in an endless maze of towering shelves and flickering shadows. Panic clawed at my throat, and just as I was about to call out, I caught sight of something, a single, unblinking eye watching me from the darkness. Paralyzed by fear, I couldn't tear my gaze away from that single, unblinking eye watching me from the shadows. It wasn't just staring, it was analyzing me, as if weighing every thought, every tremor of fear that pulsed through my veins. The eye seemed to grow larger, almost as though it were drawing closer without actually moving. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing through the thick silence, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in, closing around me like a cage. Slowly, the eye blinked, and the darkness around it shifted, revealing a faint, ghostly outline of something lurking just beyond the reach of my sight. I couldn't make out its shape entirely, but what I saw was enough, a long, twisted silhouette, too tall and thin to be human, with limbs that seemed to stretch into unnatural angles. It stood there, half hidden behind the trees, yet somehow I could feel it smiling, a chilling amusement emanating from it, as though it was savoring my terror, feeding off my helplessness. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, paralyzed by a primal fear that defied reason. Then, without warning, the shadows around it began to pulse, as if breathing in tandem with my own terrified breaths. The darkness itself seemed alive, shifting and writhing as though it were a creature all its own. With each pulse, the thing in the shadows grew sharper, more defined, and the eye grew brighter, more intense, locking onto me with a hunger that turned my blood to ice. My throat was dry, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. It was as if the entire forest was closing in, suffocating me in a cocoon of silence and shadow. And then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, yet clear as day. It was coming from all around me, a quiet, insidious voice that slipped into my mind like cold fingers. It wasn't speaking in words exactly, but the meaning was unmistakable. Welcome back. The words echoed through my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts, and with a sickening realization, I knew that whatever this place was, it was waiting for me, expecting me. The déjà vu that had gripped me earlier now twisted into something more sinister, as if some buried part of me remembered this place. not from a dream, but from a memory long forgotten. Desperately, I forced myself to move, dragging one foot forward as if through thick mud. Each step felt like an eternity, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. But the moment I turned my back, I felt it, the presence behind me growing closer, each step echoing mine, matching my pace. It was as if my every movement was being mirrored by this thing in the shadows, keeping just out of sight, yet never letting me escape its watchful gaze. I stumbled forward, nearly tripping over the twisted roots that clawed up from the ground, like skeletal fingers reaching for me. The darkness grew thicker, heavier, pressing in from all sides until I could barely see, the shadows swallowing everything in their path. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. Somewhere ahead, a faint light glowed, a small, dim sliver of hope piercing the darkness. Driven by a desperate need to escape, I forced myself toward it, each step feeling as though I was dragging my body through a nightmare I couldn't wake from. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I realized the light was coming from a doorway, barely visible between the twisted trees. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin crack of sickly yellow light spilling out from within, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, as if beckoning me closer. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to flee. But something deeper, something I couldn't explain, pulled me forward, compelling me to cross the threshold. The moment I stepped inside, the air changed, thickening with a damp, suffocating cold. The room was small, claustrophobic, its walls lined with strange symbols scratched into the decaying wood. The scratching sound was louder now, relentless, like nails scraping against the walls, circling me, closing in. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Only shadows, pressing in closer, suffocating me. And then, there it was again. That eye, now so close I could see every detail, every dark vein that pulsed with a life of its own. It filled my vision, blocking out everything else, as though the entire room had shrunk down to contain only me and this unblinking, all-seeing gaze. It wasn't just watching, it was inside my mind, probing, reaching into memories I hadn't even known were there, memories that felt old, ancient, as if they had always been waiting for this moment. And in that suffocating silence, as the eye continued to peer into the depths of my mind, I realized something truly terrifying. This was no ordinary dream. This place, this presence, it knew me. It had always known me, and it had been waiting, patiently, for me to return. As I stood there, trapped in the grip of this monstrous gaze, a terrible realization crept over me. I wasn't just being watched. I was being studied, as though some ancient predator was measuring every inch of my fear, savoring the way my body trembled, how my mind spun with desperate thoughts of escape. And yet, I couldn't look away. The eye pulsed like a black hole swallowing every shard of light, every ounce of warmth, until the room was consumed by an unnatural cold that seeped into my bones. Every shadow seemed alive, curling and shifting like dark tendrils reaching out for me. A low whisper broke the silence, so faint that I almost thought I'd imagined it. The words were distorted, twisted, like voices from beneath deep water. They coiled around my thoughts, filling my mind with fragments of something ancient and unspeakable. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets, dark and long buried, clawing their way into my consciousness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything but the whispers, which grew louder, layering over one another until they became a cacophony of pleading voices, each one more desperate, more filled with despair than the last. I stumbled backward, away from the suffocating eye, but as I did, the shadows around me seemed to ripple and distort, closing in with every step. The room began to twist in impossible ways, stretching and narrowing, as though reality itself was bending under the weight of something sinister. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the door I'd come through was gone, swallowed by darkness, leaving me trapped in this nightmare with no way out. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and the air felt thick, heavy, as if it were laced with invisible tendrils that constricted tighter with every second. Then, just when I thought the silence would drive me mad, I noticed something strange. Objects around the room, old books, dusty relics, seemed to shift positions whenever I blinked, rearranging themselves in a slow, eerie dance. A chill swept over me as I realized that every movement, every subtle change, was guiding me, as if some unseen force was manipulating the room to lead me to something I was terrified to confront. Shadows twisted in corners, forming shapes that dissolved the moment I focused on them, as if playing a cruel game with my sanity. Yet, despite my fear, a strange compulsion took hold, pulling me deeper into the heart of the room, closer to whatever lay hidden in the darkness. My hand brushed against a cold surface, a mirror, old and cracked, with a frame covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. At first, my own reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed, but then something changed. The reflection's eyes darkened, and a slow, malicious smile crept across its face, even as my own remained frozen in terror. I watched, horrified, as my reflection began to move independently, reaching up a hand toward the glass as if trying to pull me through, to drag me into whatever shadowed world it inhabited. I stumbled back, but the reflection's eyes followed me, dark and unyielding, like windows into something I could barely comprehend, something that lay just beyond the veil of reality. I could feel the presence growing stronger, suffocating, its hunger almost palpable. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though something within was struggling to break free. The whispers intensified, merging into a single, haunting phrase that filled the air. "You're almost home." The words echoed through the room, each syllable dripping with malice, a chilling promise that twisted in my gut. I looked around, desperate for any escape, but the walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows deepening, pressing against me, swallowing every inch of space until I could barely breathe. In that moment, the door creaked open at the far end of the room, revealing a sliver of faint, sickly light spilling out. The light cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the twisted contours of the room in a way that felt unnatural, wrong, as though it were cast from something not meant to be seen. I felt drawn to it, despite every part of my mind screaming in protest. But the alternative, the suffocating darkness, the unrelenting eye, left me with no choice. Driven by equal parts terror and desperate curiosity, I stumbled toward the door, my legs trembling, heart pounding as I reached out to push it open wider. But as my fingers touched the doorknob, a freezing cold shot through my hand, spreading up my arm and into my chest. I tried to pull away, but my hand was frozen to the metal, held there by some invisible force. The whispers grew louder, an unbearable symphony of agony and anger, wrapping around me, closing in until they filled every corner of my mind. I felt my vision blur, the room spinning as shadows danced before my eyes, twisting into shapes that defied logic, that seemed to pull at the edges of reality itself. And then, in the periphery of my vision, I saw it again, the eye watching me closer than ever before, its hollow gaze drilling into me. It blinked slowly, deliberately, as though savoring my terror, and I realized, with a sickening dread, that it wasn't just a part of the dream. It was aware, it was sentient, and it was waiting for me to cross that threshold, to step into the place it had been luring me toward, a place where there would be no escape, no waking up. As I crossed the threshold, the sickly yellow light intensified, bathing the room in a surreal, almost nauseating glow. I found myself standing in a small, circular chamber, the walls covered in intricate symbols carved deeply into the decaying stone. These symbols looked familiar, twisting, looping patterns that seemed to writhe beneath the surface, as if alive, as if whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I could feel something ancient, something malevolent, radiating from them, filling the air with a suffocating sense of dread. My breathing was shallow, each inhalation thick with the scent of damp stone and decay, tinged with something faintly metallic, like blood long dried and hidden away. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, rough and ancient, chiseled from a single piece of dark stone. Upon it lay a peculiar object, a small, obsidian figurine shaped like an eye, its surface polished to an unsettling gleam. The eye seemed to stare up at me with a life of its own, capturing and holding my gaze with a relentless, almost predatory intensity. I couldn't look away. It felt as though the object was boring into my soul, unraveling memories, secrets, even thoughts I hadn't yet formed. My mind spun, each second growing heavier as the eye's power gripped me tighter, filling my head with a faint, pulsating hum that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the stone. Suddenly, a surge of cold swept through the room, chilling my bones and making my skin prickle with an indescribable dread. The chamber darkened, the yellow light dimming until only shadows remained, swirling around me, thick and consuming. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the eye on the altar blinked, a single, languid motion that made my stomach lurch. It wasn't just an object, it was aware, alive, and watching me with a hunger that defied reason. I took a shaky step back, but before I could react, a low, guttural whisper filled the chamber, a voice thick with age and menace, speaking words I couldn't understand yet somehow felt branded into my mind. "You belong to me." Panic surged through me as the room began to spin, the shadows thickening, morphing into dark shapes that loomed at the edges of my vision. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears, but my limbs felt heavy, as if bound by invisible chains. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. It was as if the very air around me had been drained, replaced by a cold silence that pressed against my skin, suffocating me. The walls seemed to close in, and from the corners of the room, I saw figures beginning to take form. Tall, gaunt shadows with hollow eyes, each one staring at me with an intensity that burned through the darkness. These figures were human-like, but distorted, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long and fingers that curled into claws. They moved slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us, their hollow gazes fixed on me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. Their mouths opened in silent screams, expressions twisted with despair and anger, as if they too had been drawn to this place, trapped in this unholy chamber by the same force that had lured me here. And now they were part of it, bound to the eye on the altar, forever condemned to watch and wait, yearning for an escape that would never come. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the walls seemed to shift, twisting and closing in around me, trapping me with these spectral figures. Each shadowed form reached out, their clawed hands inches from my skin, as if eager to drag me into the depths of the darkness with them. Just as I thought I couldn't bear the sight any longer, the altar eye glowed faintly, and the figures froze, their hollow eyes still locked onto mine, as if waiting for some unspoken command. In that moment of stillness, I saw my own reflection flickering in the eye's polished surface, twisted and distorted, barely recognizable. My face appeared gaunt, hollow, as if drained of life, and my eyes, they looked like theirs, empty, haunted, trapped. The realization struck me with a sickening clarity. This place wasn't just a part of my dream. It was reaching into me, pulling me apart, stripping away pieces of my soul and feeding them into this endless, eternal darkness. With a final, desperate surge of will, I turned and ran, but the chamber seemed to expand, the walls stretching away from me, creating a corridor that grew longer with each step I took. The shadows chased after me, their whispers filling my ears, growing louder, merging into a relentless chant. Come back, come back, come back. I stumbled, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if something was pulling me backward, dragging me closer to that infernal altar, to the eye that now pulsed with a furious, vengeful glow. Just when I thought I would be pulled into the darkness forever, I closed my eyes and forced myself to focus, willing myself to wake up, to break free from the grip of this nightmare. My body tensed, my mind screaming against the hold of whatever force bound me to this place. In a final, desperate act, I took a deep breath and wrenched myself back, feeling the tendrils of darkness tear away from me, leaving cold, burning trails across my skin. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my bed, drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering against my chest like a trapped animal. The room was dark and silent, but I could still feel the weight of that gaze lingering, as if something had followed me back, as if the eye was still watching, waiting for the moment I would slip back into its world. The following days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments of the dream surged back, cold whispers, clawed shadows, the unblinking I seared into my memory. I tried to dismiss it as a nightmare, just a trick of my mind, but the sense of dread lingered, creeping into my every thought. My skin felt prickly, as though 1,000 invisible eyes were watching, assessing my every move. Then I noticed something even more disturbing, faint markings on my arm, as if ghostly fingers had left trails of frost across my skin. It was as if the dream had left a mark on me, a reminder that it wasn't finished. In a desperate attempt to make sense of it all, I began searching online, looking for any references that could explain the symbols I had seen carved into the walls of the chamber. Hours passed as I pored over obscure forums, archived articles, and ancient texts. And then something caught my eye, a single mention of an ancient, forgotten temple hidden deep in a forest, abandoned for centuries, rumored to be a place where forbidden rites were performed to summon the Watcher, a force described as an eye that never blinks, a gaze that pierces the soul. My blood ran cold. The descriptions matched my dream too perfectly. Driven by a mixture of terror and fascination, I delved deeper, uncovering old newspaper articles and local legends about this temple. There were reports of disappearances, hikers who had ventured near the area and were never seen again. Locals spoke in hushed tones of a place where the air felt wrong, where shadows moved of their own accord, and where a cold, watchful presence lingered. Some claimed to have heard whispers echoing through the trees, voices that called their names, drawing them closer to an ancient altar hidden within the ruins. The more I read, the stronger the feeling grew that I hadn't just dreamed of this place. I had been summoned to it, somehow drawn into a memory that wasn't my own. Unable to shake the sense of urgency, I decided to dig even deeper, looking up archived images and old, grainy photos of the ruins. I studied each one carefully, heart pounding as I scoured every shadowy corner for something familiar. And there it was, a single photograph, faded and torn, showing a small, dark figurine resting on an altar. The very same figurine I had seen in my dream, shaped like an eye, gleaming with an unnatural, almost predatory intensity. My hands trembled as I stared at the image. This wasn't a coincidence. Whatever I had seen wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I could feel its weight, a creeping darkness reaching out through the screen, pulling me closer to a truth I wasn't ready to face. But I couldn't stop. My mind raced with questions. Why had I been shown this place? Why did that I feel so familiar, as if it had been waiting for me? And most terrifying of all, what did it want? Determined to find answers, I tracked down local stories, contacting people who had once lived near the temple's location. Most were reluctant to speak, their voices tinged with fear, but one elderly woman finally agreed to tell me what she knew. Her voice was a strained whisper, filled with a weary dread. She spoke of the temple as a place of watchers, a spot where people went to be seen by forces beyond human understanding. She mentioned that those who entered often returned, changed, if they returned at all. "There's an eye," she said, her voice trembling. "They say it doesn't just watch. It takes. It reaches into your mind, finds your darkest fears, your secrets, and holds them like a treasure. Once it sees you, really sees you, you're never the same." Her words settled over me like a shroud, suffocating and cold. I could feel the presence from my dream creeping back, lurking just beyond the edges of reality, as if listening, waiting. The sense of being watched grew more intense, the shadows in my room lengthening and twisting in ways that seemed unnatural. I could feel the eye, even now, as though it had crossed the barrier between dream and reality, as if it were still observing me, feeding off my fear. Driven by a morbid need to understand, I decided to visit the library and look through the oldest records they had, hoping to find anything that might explain this ancient entity. In the archives, I stumbled across a journal, written by a man who claimed to have visited the temple nearly a century ago. His entries were scattered, incoherent at times, but his terror was palpable, bleeding through every page. He described being watched, feeling an eye following him everywhere, even in his dreams. His final entry chilled me to the core. "It doesn't matter where I go, or how many miles I put between myself and that place. The eye has seen me, and once it has seen you, it never lets you go." Closing the journal, my hands shook as the weight of his words sank in. It felt as though I were reliving his horror, the same terror that had driven him to madness. The eye had seen me too. It had reached into my mind, marking me as its own. Compelled by a force I couldn't resist, I decided to visit the temple. Logic and reason were drowned out by a primal, instinctive pull, as if something ancient and powerful was calling me, demanding that I confront it face to face. I packed my things, feeling the weight of dread settle over me, and drove for hours, the forests growing denser, the road narrower, as civilization faded behind me. By the time I reached the outskirts of the forest where the temple was hidden, night had fallen, casting the trees in deep, impenetrable shadow. A heavy mist clung to the ground, curling around my legs as I entered, muffling every sound and turning the world into a silenced, isolated void. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the colder the air became. It was an unnatural cold that seeped through my clothes and settled into my bones, as though the forest itself was infused with the spirit of something long dead. Every step I took echoed through the silence, amplified, as if something was repeating each sound, distorting it into a faint whisper that followed me. Shadows stretched across the ground, twisting into shapes that seemed to writhe and slither, alive in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. The trees themselves felt hostile, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms, clawing at me, as if warning me to turn back. I reached a small clearing, and there it stood, the ancient temple, half buried in the earth, its crumbling stones covered in creeping vines and moss. The structure seemed to exude a darkness of its own, a shadow that extended far beyond its physical boundaries, as if the temple itself was a portal into something deeper, something profoundly wrong. The air was thick, heavy with a stench that was both familiar and foreign, a mixture of wet soil, decaying leaves, and something metallic, like iron, that reminded me uncomfortably of blood. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, feeling that oppressive gaze once more, pressing down on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. As I reached the entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows, startling me. An old man, stooped and frail, watched me with hollow eyes, his face lined with age and etched with a haunting weariness. He introduced himself as Callum, the caretaker of the temple ruins, though it felt more as though he was its prisoner, bound to the place by an unspoken curse. He warned me with a voice that trembled with a fear I could sense was deeply rooted. "You don't belong here," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of countless warnings ignored. "The Watcher sees all who enter. Once it has seen you, there is no forgetting, no escaping. It knows your soul." Despite his warnings, something pushed me onward. I had come too far to turn back now. I nodded, swallowing my fear, and entered the temple. The stone walls were cold and damp to the touch, each step taking me deeper into the heart of darkness. Strange carvings covered the walls, symbols identical to those I'd seen in my dream. They twisted and writhed in the flickering light of my flashlight, giving the illusion of movement, as though they were alive, breathing. The air grew colder still, heavy with an unnatural quiet, the kind that weighs on the mind, distorting thoughts and pulling at the edges of sanity. As I moved further in, I felt a shift in the air, a subtle change that made my skin prickle with unease. The shadows thickened, coalescing into forms that seemed almost human, yet twisted and misshapen, their hollow eyes fixed on me with an unyielding intensity. They lined the corridor, each figure more grotesque than the last, their faces contorted in expressions of agony and fear, frozen in silent screams. It felt as though I were walking through a gallery of lost souls, each one trapped in an endless cycle of torment, bound to this cursed place by whatever ancient force dwelled within. Then, from the far end of the corridor, I heard a familiar sound, the faint, rhythmic tapping I'd heard in my dream, echoing through the silence. The sound reverberated off the walls, each tap sending a shiver down my spine. It was calling me, drawing me deeper, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls, twisting and merging into shapes that defied reason. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as I rounded a corner and found myself in a large, circular chamber, the heart of the temple. There, in the center of the room, stood the altar. It was exactly as I had seen it in my dream, a rough stone slab, carved with the same sinister symbols, and upon it, the obsidian eye glistened in the dim light, dark and watchful. My heart hammered as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I couldn't look away. The eye seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were aware of my presence, as though it had been waiting, watching, for this very moment. I reached out, compelled by a force beyond my control, my fingers brushing against the cold, polished surface of the eye. The instant I touched it, a surge of icy energy shot through me, freezing my blood and filling my mind with visions of the souls who had come before, drawn to this place, each one lost, consumed by the darkness that dwelled within. I saw their faces, twisted in horror, their eyes hollow, each one bearing the same mark, the same haunting emptiness that I now felt spreading within me. The whispers returned louder, closer, filling the room with a cacophony of desperate voices, each one pleading, warning, lost in an endless echo of despair. Then I felt it, a presence standing directly behind me, so close I could feel its icy breath on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, every nerve screaming in terror, and found myself face to face with the shadowed figure from my dream. It towered over me, its form indistinct, a dark void with hollow, unblinking eyes that bore into mine, seeing through me, reaching into the deepest recesses of my mind. It was the Watcher. I knew that now. It had been waiting, watching, drawing me here, feeding off my fear, my curiosity, my need to understand. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as its gaze pierced me, unraveling my thoughts, my memories, as though I were nothing more than a plaything in its hands. In that moment, I understood the truth. The Watcher was not merely a guardian of the temple. It was a parasite, a being that fed on the souls it ensnared, binding them to this place, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment and despair. And now, it had chosen me as its next victim. With a surge of desperation, I tore myself away, stumbling backward, my mind reeling, every fiber of my being consumed by terror. The Watcher's hollow eyes followed, unyielding, a silent promise that escape was impossible, that it would never stop watching, never stop waiting. As I fled the chamber, the whispers followed, echoing in my mind, growing fainter but never truly fading. The forest loomed around me as I ran, the shadows twisting, the trees seeming to close in, as if the entire world were conspiring to trap me within the Watcher's gaze forever. Even now, as I write this, I feel it still, a presence, a weight, a gaze that follows me wherever I go. The Watcher saw me, truly saw me, and I know that its eye will never close, never release me from the darkness it has left inside. After fleeing the temple, I thought I had escaped the Watcher's grip, but I was wrong. Its presence lingered like a shadow, an invisible weight pressing against my mind. Each night, as darkness crept into my room, I felt the same cold, unyielding gaze boring into me, watching, waiting. The hollow eyes of the Watcher haunted my dreams, pulling me back to that ancient temple, back to the altar where it had first seen me. I could feel it, even now, a twisted connection that defied distance, a bond forged in fear and bound by shadows. No matter how far I ran, I knew that I could never truly escape. As the days passed, I noticed strange things happening around me, subtle at first, but undeniably real. Objects in my house seemed to move on their own. Books shifted on the shelves, doors creaked open in the dead of night, and shadows danced in the corners of my vision, fleeting but persistent. Each time I looked, they disappeared, but the unsettling feeling remained, gnawing at my sanity. It was as though the Watcher had found a way to seep into my reality, corrupting the world around me, distorting it, leaving traces of itself in every darkened corner. Then one night, I awoke to a sound, an unmistakable tapping, faint but insistent, echoing through the silence of my bedroom. It was the same rhythmic tapping I had heard in the temple, the sound that had haunted my dreams. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen, my breath shallow, cold sweat trickling down my spine. The tapping grew louder, filling the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I glanced around, but there was nothing, only the darkness pressing in, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a shroud. And then I saw it, a faint glow coming from the mirror across the room. The light was dim, sickly, pulsating in time with the tapping, drawing me closer against my will. As I approached, the reflection in the mirror began to shift, distorting, twisting until it no longer looked like me. Instead, I saw a figure cloaked in shadow, with hollow eyes that stared back at me, dark and endless, the eyes of the Watcher. I froze, paralyzed by fear, as the figure reached out, pressing its hand against the glass. My own reflection mimicked the gesture, though I hadn't moved, as though something else were controlling my body, forcing me to become part of its dark reflection. Suddenly, the room around me seemed to fade, dissolving into shadow, until there was nothing left but me and the mirror, an endless void stretching out behind it. The Watcher's eyes bore into mine, piercing, unraveling me, stripping away every layer of my being until I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a soul laid bare. In that moment, I understood. It was here, fully, completely, crossing the boundaries between worlds, pulling me into its grasp. With a surge of horror, I realized that the mirror was no longer just glass. It was a doorway, a portal into the Watcher's domain. I felt its cold, clawed fingers wrapping around my mind, tugging me forward, closer to the abyss, as if to pull me through, to drag me into its world where I would be lost forever. I tried to pull back, to break free, but my reflection remained unmoved, staring back at me with a twisted smile that wasn't my own. My heart thundered, my mind screaming in terror, but I was powerless, trapped within its gaze. Then, I remembered something the caretaker had told me. Once it sees you, it takes. The words echoed in my mind, a grim reminder that escape was futile, that the Watcher's gaze would never release me. But somewhere within that despair, a spark of defiance flickered. If I was to face it, I would do so on my own terms. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached out and pressed my hand against the mirror, feeling a cold that burned, searing my skin as if branding me, binding me to the darkness. The world shifted. The mirror dissolved, and I found myself standing in the heart of the temple once again, the altar looming before me, the obsidian eye gleaming with a hunger that seemed to grow with every passing moment. The chamber was filled with shadows, twisting, writhing figures with hollow eyes watching me, waiting. I was surrounded, trapped, but I could feel the Watcher's presence more intensely than ever, as if it had become part of me, its cold gaze intertwined with my soul. The eye on the altar pulsed, filling the room with an unnatural glow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and coil around me, binding me in place. I could feel its power coursing through me, a dark energy that sapped my strength, draining my will. My vision blurred, the shadows closing in, and in that moment, I understood the choice I had to make. The Watcher was offering me an escape, of sorts. It wanted my surrender, a piece of my very being, in exchange for freedom. But what freedom could there be if part of me was bound to this cursed place, this darkness that would forever linger, haunting every corner of my mind? With trembling hands, I reached toward the altar, my fingers grazing the surface of the eye. A surge of icy power shot through me, filling my mind with visions, Endless corridors of shadow, faces twisted in horror, souls trapped within the Watcher's domain, bound to it for eternity. I knew that if I surrendered, I would join them, lost within the darkness, my own existence dissolving into nothingness, leaving only a hollow shell. But then, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and there it stood, the Watcher, its form barely visible, a mass of shadows with hollow eyes that seemed to see everything, every fear, every regret, every moment of weakness. It loomed over me, vast and unending, a darkness that stretched beyond comprehension. And then it spoke, not in words, but in thoughts, echoing within my mind. Choose. I closed my eyes, bracing myself, and with one last act of defiance, I pulled my hand away from the eye, refusing its offer, denying it the surrender it craved. The Watcher's gaze intensified, its hollow eyes narrowing in anger, a low growl reverberating through the chamber, shaking the very ground beneath me. The shadows around me twisted, writhing in fury, but I stood firm, resisting the pull, clinging to whatever fragments of myself I could hold on to. Then, in a final burst of rage, the Watcher's form dissolved into darkness, the shadows collapsing inward, folding in on themselves, until the chamber was empty, silent, the altar dark once more. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my body drenched in cold sweat. The silence was deafening, the air thick with a lingering dread, but I knew I had survived for now. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my room, the morning light streaming through the window, bathing everything in an eerie calm. But I knew deep down that the Watcher's gaze would never truly leave me. It was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting, watching, bound to me as I was to it. And I knew that someday, perhaps in a dream, perhaps in some dark corner of reality, I would face it again. Even in the daylight, I could feel its presence lingering, clinging to me like a shadow I could never shake. Every corner of my home felt darker, every mirror a silent threat, a doorway waiting to pull me back into the nightmare. As the days passed, subtle signs began to haunt me. Strange markings appeared on the walls, faint, claw-like scratches that seemed to etch themselves deeper each time I looked away. Objects in my home seemed to shift on their own, disappearing and reappearing in odd places. My reflection in mirrors would sometimes linger a split second too long, as if something on the other side was studying me, waiting for the right moment to reach out. Sleep became an impossibility. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself pulled back into the same dark corridors, the shadows stretching around me, the whispering voices growing louder. I would awaken drenched in sweat, my heartbeat thundering, but the relief was fleeting. The presence of the Watcher was with me, its gaze pressing on my mind, filling me with an endless, gnawing dread. I could feel it in the silence, hear its whispers in the dead of night, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat that pulsed from within the walls. One night, as I lay in bed, half drifting between sleep and waking, I heard it again, that faint, rhythmic tapping that had once haunted my dreams, now echoing through my room. My blood turned cold, and I sat up, straining to listen, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something knocking against the walls of reality, trying to force its way through. I followed the sound, each step filled with dread, leading me to the hallway mirror. There in the glass I saw it, an eye barely visible lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. Its gaze bore into me, and in that moment, I felt a surge of memories, images of that cursed temple, the symbols, the shadows, all flashing before me with a terrifying clarity. I reached out, almost unconsciously, drawn to the mirror, my fingers brushing against the glass. The surface was cold, unbearably so, and as I touched it, I felt the boundary between worlds begin to waver. The eye pulsed, growing brighter, and in the reflection I saw myself, but twisted, hollow, as if a piece of my soul had been stripped away, leaving only a shadow. Desperate for answers, I turned to the old journal I had found in the library, flipping through its pages with trembling hands. The entries were barely legible, scrawled in a hurried, frantic script, but one line stood out, written in bold, shaky letters. Once it has seen you, it never forgets. The words chilled me to the core, a reminder that the Watcher was always there, hidden in the fabric of reality, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. The journal continued with ominous details, accounts of others who had encountered the Watcher and were never the same. They described it as a parasite, a being that clings to the soul, feeding off fear, growing stronger each time it was acknowledged. And then, something even more disturbing caught my eye. A series of symbols drawn in the margins of the journal, identical to those I'd seen in the temple. Beneath them was a warning, barely decipherable: do not look. Do not listen. It feeds on attention. Ignore it, and you may yet be free. I closed the journal, heart pounding, the instructions echoing in my mind. Could it be that by acknowledging the Watcher, by fearing it, I was strengthening its hold on me? But how could I ignore something that was always there, lurking, watching? In the days that followed, I tried to heed the warning, to ignore the shadows, the whispers, the eyes that lingered in every reflective surface. But the more I tried, the stronger the presence grew. It was as if the Watcher could sense my resistance, as if it took pleasure in my struggle. Every time I turned away from a mirror, I felt its gaze intensify, as if daring me to look back, to give in to the fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept across my room, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to look out the window. The street was empty, silent, but there, standing in the faint glow of the street lamp, was a figure, a dark silhouette with hollow eyes, staring up at me from the darkness. My heart raced as I backed away, yet I couldn't tear my gaze from it. It didn't move, didn't blink. It simply stood there, watching, a silent reminder that no matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to escape, it would always find me. In a final act of desperation, I decided to leave. I packed a few belongings, telling myself that distance would weaken its grip, that maybe I could outrun the Watcher's gaze. But as I drove down the darkened road, the sense of being watched only grew stronger, as if the shadows themselves were following me, creeping along the edges of the road, twisting into shapes that seemed to reach out from the darkness. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it, the faint outline of hollow eyes, staring back at me, closer with each passing mile. Eventually, I stopped in a small, deserted motel, hoping to lose it in the anonymity of the unfamiliar. But even there, in the dim, flickering light of the room, the feeling persisted. The mirror on the wall seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the faint outline of an eye barely visible in its reflection. I tried to ignore it, to turn away, but the whispers returned, filling the silence, growing louder, drowning out my thoughts. The Watcher was there, closer than ever, its presence filling the room, pressing in from every side. In a final, horrifying moment of clarity, I realized the truth. The Watcher was no longer just a shadow lurking in my dreams. It was part of me now, woven into the fabric of my existence, its gaze forever bound to mine. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would never be alone again. I was marked, claimed by an entity that would never release me, a presence that would follow me to the end of my days. As I sit here, writing these final words, I can feel it standing just behind me, its hollow eyes watching, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I know now that there is no escape, no end to the nightmare. The Watcher is patient, relentless, and it will wait for as long as it takes. And so I leave this warning for anyone who finds these words. Beware the Watcher, the eye that never blinks, the presence that never forgets. For once it sees you, it will follow you forever, a shadow in the darkness, an echo in the silence, a reminder that some things are never truly left behind. As the final light in my room dims, I catch one last glimpse of those hollow eyes in the reflection, and I know that my story has only begun.